Hey everybody, welcome to the Williams Selyem Fall Release Preview. Over the next hour or so, we hope to share with you some insights on our upcoming release of our 2018 Vineyard Designate wines, as well as answer a number of great questions that have already been submitted. We were overjoyed by the number of folks that decided to join us online tonight. I mean, we really do have the best customers. I've been watching everyone chiming in with what they're trying. I just see Marshall Gelb from Redondo Beach. We have somebody from Japan that's tuning in, locals, a lot of folks out in Hudson River Valley. So thanks for joining us. And we hope you enjoy our first of many virtual release previews and other monthly webinars. The new normal has inspired us to get creative, so we'll be doing one of these a month. I'm Mark Malpiede, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Williams Selyem, and I have the pleasure of introducing some of our other participants tonight. Scott Herman will not be on camera, but he's going to be behind the scenes making sure all of this technology runs correctly, we hope. Julie Ramos is helping us out on the chat board. Carly Dupuy and Sandrew Montgomery, they'll be tasting and adding their opinion and commentary about the wines. And Director of Winemaking, Jeff Mangahas, will be our main host. Our format tonight is an attempt to replicate our internal tasting prior to each release. Twice a year, Jeff hosts a tasting for the company, so we get to taste the wines and learn as much as possible before we interact with you, our customers. This fall release has 20 wines in total, but we thought that might be a bit too much for this format. So we're going to look at 10 different wines tonight in an attempt to cover the broad spectrum from Pinot Noir to Chardonnay to Zinfandel. Along the way, we'll answer your questions and do our best to inform you about the entire release. We hope you all have a glass of wine nearby, and from the comments, from 2010 Morning Dew to 16 Terra, looks like you all do. But let us know what's in your glass through the chat function. We encourage comments and questions as we go along. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to tell you a bit about himself and how he came to be at Williams Selyem as we get our tasting rolling. So cheers, and Jeff, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark, for that introduction. Welcome to everybody, family and friends. I know there's a lot of, I've got a lot of family and friends up in Washington watching this today. Yeah, a little bit about me. Hopefully, many of you I've met over the years. Gosh, this is my 20th vintage in the Russian River Valley. This is my 10th year at Williams and Selyem. It's I mean, what a historic place to be. I've had the fortunate opportunity of making wines throughout the Russian River Valley and the Sonoma coast, and Williams Selyem is sort of the pinnacle, right? I mean, we have, gosh, I have to count 25 different Pinot Noirs that we make. So many different Chardonnays. We'll have a chance to taste a couple of those, and a bunch of different Zinfandels. And yeah, I mean, Williams Selyem is a study in terroir. And it's truly an honor to make some of these wines. Some of my very first experiences with Williams Selyem was, when I was at a tasting when I was a master's candidate for the enology program at Davis. And there were two bottles on the table. I remember it was a 96 Allen Pinot Noir and a 96 Rochioli Vineyard Pinot Noir. And they absolutely blew me away with how distinctive and unique and different they are. And those two vineyards are right across the street from each other, so it really is a study in terroir, different soil types, different microclimates, and yeah, I mean, it was really those wines that made me really want to dive deeper into Russian River Valley wines and certainly Pinot Noir. And I enjoy Pinots from all over the world: Burgundy, New Zealand, what have you, Oregon. Yeah, it's truly an honor to make these wines today at Williams Selyem. Quick, little bit more background about me. I was a molecular biology student from the University of Washington. I was a research scientist before I got into winemaking, and tasted a bunch of wines up in Washington, and really kind of the discovery of wine. Why wines tasted the way they do, just fascinated me. And so, after a successful career as a research scientist, I wanted to dive into something else, and went back to school to get my master's degree from Davis. in winemaking, and here I am 20 years later. It's a dream come true for sure, absolutely. So we've got a bunch of different wines to go through. This release is about the 2018 vintage. In California, it's just a pleasure to make wine in California because the weather is just really so perfect most of the time. There really isn't a vintage in recent times, and certainly in my 20-year career in the Russian River Valley, that there really isn't an interesting story about the different vintages. And we've been on a wonderful run these past few years, leading up to 2020, which is a really exceptional year as well. But 2018 was, the story of 18 was really that there was no weather issues. It was a very even growing season. It was a drought year. We only had about 25 inches below average rainfall, 25 inches of rain. We had a little bit of a longer bloom schedule. Typically blooms only a couple of weeks long. In 2018, it was a little bit longer than that. So that kind of created a little bit of complexity, I think, in the wines. Longer bloom, different flavor profiles over the kind of the course of that bloom schedule. And it really, I kind of think of it as, building layers and complexity. So I think it's a really outstanding vintage on the whole. Some nice potential ageability as well. These wines had, I think early on they were a little bit shy, and I think they're just now starting to kind of emerge and show their full potential. Other comparisons to some other vintages, 2017 was a super wet year. 2019 was a super wet year as well. Took a little bit longer for everything to sort of come together. Hot season in 2017, a short bloom schedule in 2019. So yeah, different stories that affect the wines in certainly different ways. I am very excited about the 18 vintage. They are young. Give them a little bit of time, but there's a tremendous amount of layers and complexity that'll come out with even a few years of bottle age. Quick note about 2020 vintage. Another drought year, super cold, cold, wet, super cold sort of winter, dry season, only about 20 inches of rain this year. But the weather has just been cool and perfect this whole year. No heat spikes, which is really good for the long, slow sort of maturation of the vines. And we're turning color right now, so it's Veraison. We're about 30 days away from harvest, which is about average for us. So yeah, look for 2020 as well. Should be another great vintage. Okay, well, let's dive into some tasting. Hopefully you have a glass and you can kind of taste along. We're going to start out with the 2018 Drake Estate Chardonnay. If you have a Chardonnay in your glass, go ahead and give that a smell. This is one of our vineyards out in the town of Guerneville. It's on the coast. It's Russian River, but it's sort of on that edge of climate. It has a lot of coastal fog. It's one of our latest sites. Certainly one of our latest Chardonnays. In the very first year that I joined Williams Selyem, 2011, which was a very cool year, we harvested these grapes on my birthday, actually, November 1st, which is very late. Typically, in an average season, we're harvesting this more like in October, late September. But that coolness of site really allows for a really thick skin to develop on the plants. Because of the challenge of the site, the coolness of the site, it tends to have a thick skin. And oftentimes we don't really think about tannin structure in white wine, but I think this is a great example that helps kind of build sort of the texture and the richness in Chardonnay. It's got typically like a Meyer lemon kind of note, and you think about Meyer lemons and that sort of spicy sort of quality. Typically sort of a yellow apple, maybe even a green apple, that kind of thing. I don't know, Carly, what do you think? Do you like it? Showing nice.
It's a beautiful wine. I think the Brick Estate is just such a fascinating property, and especially the Chardonnay from this is like you mentioned, that kind of the tannin structure that adds to just the complexity and the layers of this wine, and being such a unique spot in the Russian River. It almost feels like it has a foot between the Russian River and the Sonoma Coast appellation.
For sure, yeah. Even though Chardonnay is, we harvest it at night, it's whole cluster pressed. It's a quick pressing. It only takes about 90 minutes or so. But it's that thickness of skin that really delivers, I think, an added level of depth to the wine. This is an all barrel fermented Chardonnay, just like the other one that we'll taste. We practice a lot of batonnage with the Chardonnays to help build that richness. And it's like cooking. I love to cook, and thinking about layering those different elements. The tannin from the oak, the wonderful site, the skin tannin, the yeast proteins are all layered in there that create, I think, wonderful textures. If you haven't really explored our Chardonnays, I think they're just like our Pinot Noirs. They're really examples of terroir and uniqueness of site. So I encourage everybody to explore the Chardonnays. We have some 5-6 different Chardonnays. I can't even count anymore.
More than that, we actually have 4 in this release. So we have the Drake Estate, which we're trying now, the Williams Selyem Estate, which we're about to jump into next, and then the 2 that we're not tasting are the Allen Vineyard Chardonnay and the Lewis McGregor Estate Vineyard Chardonnay.
Yeah. And just a quick note, our Chardonnays, I like the temperature that we're drinking them right now or tasting them. Cellar temperature, just there's so much nuance and delicacy and and power at the same time. But you lose that when the wines are too cold. So I encourage you to kind of drink our Chardonnays certainly at cellar temperature or just with a slight chill on them. It enables full expression of the fruit. Okay. Wow. On to the Williams Selyem Estate Chardonnay now.
So Jeff, this is one of our newer releases. We've been making the Estate Chardonnay. I think 16 was the first year, so this will be our third year in it. And it's different from our other Chardonnays. And I know we have a mass selection planting of Chardonnay down there, but can you explain a little bit about that?
For sure, yeah. So this is right here. If you've visited our estate on Westside Road, this is just below. It's just on the other side of Westside Road, just below the winery here. Beautiful Chardonnay country. So it's on the river side of Westside Road, and this particular Chardonnay, it's about a 3-acre block. It has 20 different Chardonnay clones, and we can, next time you see me, we can kind of dive deep into it a little bit more. But just like with Pinot Noirs, there's different clones, genetic variants of Chardonnay, and each one has a different structure, acid profile, tannin structure, and aromatic profile. And what immediately, when you taste any of our 2 Chardonnays, this one in particular, plus one of our other Chardonnays, the first thing that kind of comes to the nose is like flowers and honeysuckle and pear and things like that. And that's due to a particular variation clone of Chardonnay called it's called Rued, R-U-E-D, and it's a muscatty sort of version of Chardonnay. Genetically, Chardonnay is just a slight variation on that, and it just has high aromatics. And to me, you stick your nose in there, and it literally is a bouquet of like white flowers and honeysuckle. The oak is unobtrusive in the wine. It really highlights, I think, that bright freshness of Russian River with that added sort of floral complexity. It's quite a unique wine.
It's got a ton of minerality on it, especially on the finish, and that's one of my favorite things. While we use the same winemaking style and everything, all of these wines are really very different. I think the Allen Vineyard Chardonnay often has kind of more of a rounder feel to it, but the estate Chardonnay definitely has that kind of flinty minerality on the end that I love.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, that minerality kind of relates. I always like to think about it as it relates to the tannin structure and the sensation of minerals. And there's all these different, it's fascinating to go through the vineyard, and we have each one of the vines labeled as to what clone they are. So I know one of them's a Wente, one's an old selection called C's, another is the Ruid. There's even some French suitcase clones in there. One of them's a Montrachet. So yeah, and each one has a different profile, and it's amazing. I think this is an example of each one adding a different layer, and each clone adding something different, and that's what really creates, I think, the complexity in this wine, and certainly the uniqueness. If it's a wine that you haven't had before, it's just absolutely kind of mesmerizing, the different aromas. So definitely seek it out if you haven't tried it.
So Jeff, one of the questions that we got before the tasting was about the style of the Chardonnay, the philosophy of the Chardonnay,
Yep.
and also about the alcohol content, and how, since you've been the winemaker, you joined us in 2011, have you made any changes? What's your approach to it? Give a little bit on that if you could.
Yeah, for sure. We'll start with the winemaking part of it. It's, again, we always start with any discussion about any of our wines, it always starts with a unique site. So each of these sites are super different. They have different, kind of stories about them. So really, the goal of the winemaker, or a winemaker, certainly my philosophy, is to highlight that place as much as possible. And so you kind of alluded to it a little bit, Mark, which is, the winemaking is very similar across all the different products that we make. And so that definitely carries true with the Chardonnays. There's low oak usage, low meaning like 25% new French oak. And we're using a couple of different types of barrels. We're using a barrel called a Marcel Cadet, which is a water bent barrel, and Terranceau, which is traditionally actually kind of it's a Burgundian barrel, but it's also typically used in Cabernet winemaking. So low oak usage. The wines actually sort of are fermented with natural yeast, so the indigenous yeast. Picked, sort of over time. What I love to drink, and I think what's also most expressive of the site is trying to pick it a little bit earlier. And I think that preserves more of the natural acidity. Hopefully, when you taste one of our Chardonnays, that you're kind of wowed with they're vivacious. They have nice acid profile. Everything is kind of centered around that acid without it poking out too much, and so by picking a little bit earlier, we're preserving that natural acidity, particularly the pH. I like to have that pH nice and low, and that's also good, I think, for longevity of the wines. They tend to hang out for a little bit longer and stay fresh. So yeah, definitely a conscious choice to pick it a little bit earlier, but also maybe more intensive farming as well, which I think helps bring more concentration to the grape as well. So yeah, each of the different Chardonnays have a different story, and they all taste different. Just hopefully like our Pinot Noirs, they all have a different profile. So.
That's a great segue to the Pinot Noirs. So we're going to start out with the next three wines that we're going to discuss are three from the Russian River Valley, the Eastside Road Neighbors, and I've seen on the comments some folks are trying previous vintages of that. The Calegari Pinot Noir, which is a component in the Eastside Road Neighbors, and the Rochioli Riverblock Pinot Noir. So how was 18 for Pinot Noir, Jeff?
Yeah, Pinot Noir was pretty outstanding in 18. As I mentioned earlier, that sort of longer bloom schedule. that's sort of an important part. That's one of the most important parts, actually, when there's a discussion about the quality of the vintage. And typically, you know, May, June is sort of a flowering schedule. And, you know, in this particular year, it took a little bit, because we had a cool period during the flowering. Each of the flowers, you know, kind of, even within a given cluster, you know, started flowering at different times. And what oftentimes happens is you end up with what we call hens and chicks, or the French term mirandage, which means there's a lot of ways to describe it, but hens and chicks, big berries, little berries. Tom Rochioli always he refers to it as peas and pumpkins, but the same concept. Where you have, yeah, no, it's kind of funny. It's funny to see all of our growers have a slight different vernacular. And so, you know, in this particular season, because of that extended bloom period, temperature, you know, fluctuated, and that affected the quality of the set. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. It really developed the big berries and the tiny little berries that they oftentimes don't have seeds in them. But they have a really dark color. They have, because they have a lot of the anthocyanin in them, without a lot of juice. And so it ends up making wines, I think, with nice depth, nice color. Our wines always have, I think, really beautiful color to them. And so I think that's a pretty outstanding attribute for the 18 vintage. Eastside Road Neighbors is a fascinating wine because, you know, for me, I have the luxury of understanding what goes into each one of these products, right? And so Eastside Road has our Lewis McGregor estate. Mark mentioned a couple of them already. Calegari and Foss are the predominant components of it. And for me, I can pick out each one of those, right? And we'll, you know, if anybody has a Calegari wine open, you know, that's the next wine that we'll taste. But you always get that sort of bright red fruit. When I stick my nose in the Eastside Road Neighbors, you know, I get that sort of like cranberry, red raspberry kind of notes, even that little bit of hint of like rose petals. The Foss Vineyard has a little bit more of an earthy kind of quality to it, and you know, that really comes through on the nose as well. Pretty, you know, Eastside Road, with respect to our spring wine counterpart, which is the Westside Road. Eastside's a little bit hotter. I'm looking at it right now as I'm talking to you across the river. It's up on a hilltop. A lot of these vineyards are on hillsides. The soil is just a little bit drier over there, and so typically we'll actually start harvest over on the east side of the Russian River. The soil dries out a little sooner. There's earlier bud break, and then there's earlier flowering. And you know, in some years when it gets really warm, you definitely get more of a more brooding, darker sort of fruit element in the Eastside Road Neighbors, in the vineyard designate wines as well as the blend.
Do the neighbors change, Jeff, or are they consistent year to year? That was a question that came in on the side.
No, that's a great question. I mean, we're really fortunate that, you know, I get to work with the same fruit, the exact same blocks, down to the same rows every year. So there's built-in consistency in pretty much all of our products. You know, we might play around with some new vineyards here and there. Those would most likely end up in, say, like the Russian River Valley. But you know, there's consistency in the wine. Really, the variation will be in the vintage. The seasonality is really kind of where the differences lie. Yeah, great wine. It's it's a wine that you would want to drink with maybe just a few years of age on them. But really, you're kind of drink your Sonoma County wines. Then, you know, maybe Russian River, maybe this wine, and then as you kind of wait on your vineyard designates. But this often has just easy appeal when the wine is young. So don't hesitate to pull the cork if you want to pull the cork.
Yeah, and we are getting literally hundreds of questions and comments. So I'm just going to say up front. And by the way, some of them are hysterical, and I'm trying to keep a straight face. But we can't get to all of them. We'll get to as many of them as we can here and there. Anyway, so we have the Eastside Road neighbors and the Calegari. Jeff, if you want to continue on, and thank you for all the comments.
I wish I could see all the comments actually, but hopefully they're all good things. The Calegari, this is a real favorite of the vintage. This is a vineyard that's getting on 20 years old. It's on Eastside Road. It's owned by Don and Patsy Calegari. I can see it on the other side of the hilltop. It's got that beautiful. To me, I describe it, and I apologize if the tasting notes every year are on this particular wine are redundant. But to me, it's a classic Russian River wine in the sense that it has this beautiful red fruit character, right? I mean, it's everything red, cranberry, red raspberry, some strawberry, red cherry kind of notes, and even the differences between different rose, the smell of different types of roses. To me, this always connotes like red rose for some reason. It has that classic red fruit character, juicy, typically kind of geeking out a little bit. It's got really low pH, so that means it's got a higher acid sort of content. Again, we tend to pick it on the earlier side, and it just has this juicy, fresh, zesty I think is a great word for the palate on this one. And it finishes with wonderful tea-like elements, which I look for in Pinot Noir. Definitely a good wine to enjoy with food because of that acid profile. But year in, year out, no matter what the season, it's all about the red fruits.
Hey, Jeff, there's been a few questions about clones. And since we're on the Calegari, can you tell us a little bit about the clone selection there, but in general, our approach to clones in the Russian River Valley?
For sure. Russian River, clones are really complicated. With that said, it's really simple where we farm, in that most of where we are on West Side Road, East Side Road, it's a little bit warmer climate. I tend to prefer, and this is actually what Bert, I remember having a discussion with Bert years ago, Pommard tended to be his favored clone. And one of the reasons for that is it tends to have a thicker skin. It tends to be a little bit more pulpy as opposed to juicy. And it tends to have a really great mid-palate weight and texture. So, given that it's California and certainly in the part of the Russian River where we grow grapes and where the winery is, it's a little bit warmer microclimate. And so you definitely need those clones that can withstand, the temperature, kind of fluctuations. And so, in that same family, Pommard, in the same family as Pommard, there are these heirloom clones called Swan Selection, and Mount Eden. Those are three of actually my favorite clones, and most of the vineyards that we source from, those clones exist because they all offer something slightly different from a palate perspective. And again, getting back to that sort of cooking analogy, different layers. When you're making a great stew, you're starting with a mirepoix, then you're reducing some red wine, and then you're braising the meat, for example. So each one of those elements in the cooking process create layers and textures. And so by having different clones, we're having different layers of flavor that really round out the wine. In Calegari, for example, there's Mount Eden and Swan, and a particular Dijon clone, which does well in this area. Typically, Dijon clones, names like 777, 667, those are what's called Dijon clones. They tend to be a little bit thinner skinned. don't necessarily do as well in these warmer climates, but 115 can, and that's what's planted at the Calegari vineyard. And for me, my brain can pick apart those different elements of the wine. The Mount Eden gives that acid, the Swan gives that beautiful perfume to it, and the 115 offers a little bit more structure in this particular wine.
Nice. Let's move on to the Rochioli. So one of our classic vineyards in the Russian River Valley, really the vineyard that helped establish Russian River Valley as a place for incredible Pinot Noir.
Absolutely. Rochioli is one of the quintessential vineyards. The Rochiolis were one of the first folks to plant here on West Side Road, along with the Bacigalupis, or we'll taste the Zinfandel from later. Classic vineyard. This one's on most of the sites that we source from are from the hillside. So that's our Williams Selyem estate, Bucher, Bacigalupi, Flax that goes into the West Side Road neighbors, and Allen are all on the hillside. Rochioli is unique. It's on the riverbank, hence the name, Riverblock. It has a particularly unique sandy, kind of gravelly soil. Where we're sourcing from for this block was planted in 1989 to the Rochioli selection of Pinot Noir, and they call it the West Block selection, which was the original planting in the 50s. And it has just, I think, one of the most perfect climates. Because it's right on the riverbank, it enjoys, this cool kind of climate. It can definitely get warm there, but I think that cooling effect of where it is really slows down the ripening process. These roots go really deep. 1989 planting, as I said. And effectively, these plants are dry farmed because they just have this massive root system that sustains the plants. Really interesting aromatic profile in this particular wine. There's some dark brooding elements. That's a word I use a lot, I think, when it describes this wine. But there's also this sort of, what I look for in Pinot Noir in general are these sort of dried herb kind of characteristics. That's something I also use in my tasting notes a lot. That's inherent, I think, an inherent quality of Pinot Noir, having that sort of dried herb, fresh herb quality. And here it kind of smells like fennel to me, which is kind of surprisingly, wild fennel grows all around the Russian River, right? If you take any type of walks, along the, these riparian areas on West Side Road, and there's tons of fennel, and it just somehow, maybe not necessarily that there's fennel in the wine, but just sort of that fresh herb quality, really deep and strong on the palate. It rightfully is so one of our quintessential wines. This wine has so much longevity, and when you taste this particular vintage, and this is a wow wine for sure. I don't know, any comments, Sandrew or Mark, what you guys think of it?
Yeah, I definitely am picking up those base notes that you're talking about with the fennel. This wine is just marvelous, and interesting you should say that the vines were planted in '89. That's actually when I became a Williams Selyem member.
Oh, cool.
And it was Bert that turned me on to the '87 Rochioli at that time. So I'm still a huge fan. I know this has got a lot of time to evolve and develop those layers of complexity, but man, this is delish.
It's awesome.
Yeah, perfect time to introduce Sandrew. Sandrew is one of is our expert in food and wine pairing. He's actually the author of a food and wine book called The Dancing Somm. And he's going to talk a little bit about food and wine pairing for us now. So Sandrew, take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, Mark. Appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. And before I talk about the pairings, because we're not going to break them out with each individual wines that we've just been tasting, we'll do it collective. But as Mark had mentioned at the top of the broadcast, we are going to be having these webinars once a month. And so I'll be doing one on demystifying wine and food pairings, and that's coming up in September. So be on the lookout through email for that. So a couple things come to mind, especially since we're in summertime and we're grilling and chilling. So how about we throw some baby back ribs with a double secret dry rub on the grill. And instead of doing a traditional barbecue sauce to lift out some of the blackberries and plums, we're going to do a boysenberry hoisin sauce. Maybe some cinnamon yam frites on the side. Now, another dish we could do too could be lamb, or we could even do a duck. So we could do a duck breast that's pan-seared. And then, of course, we want to render off all that fat and keep the skin side down nice and crispy. We take some Bing cherries that have been dehydrated, and that's going to pull out some of that Russian River fruit that's so evident in all these wines. And then to pull out some of the spices from the Francois Frere barrels, we'll sprinkle a little Asian 5-spice on there, which will pull out the cinnamon, the nutmeg, the clove, the star anise, and the ginger in there gives it a nice little curveball, a little contrast to it. And you'll be receiving these wines in October, so it'll be the perfect time to have a heavy dish like that with perhaps some creamy wild mushroom risotto on the side.
That's awesome. You're making us hungry, Sandrew, as always. So we're going to roll into our next flight now. So we're in the Russian River, and now we wanted to talk about some of our areas that are a little bit further apart. So this next flight is going to be from our Vista Verde vineyard down in the Central Coast, outside of Hollister. Our Weir vineyard Pinot Noir from up in Mendocino County, and the Coastlands Pinot Noir on the Sonoma Coast. So, Jeff, what can you tell us about these wines and why we source fruit from these different regions?
Yeah. I mean, Pinot Noir is a fascinating study in the sense of place, that word terroir. The way I like to describe it is, Pinot Noir is very transparent to the climate, the soil, a little bit vine age as well. But it really, because it's so loosely veiled, as a comparison, Syrah and Cabernet, for example, can be really strong and can certainly overpower. Certainly winemaking can have a big influence on that. But because Pinot Noir is a little bit lighter bodied wine, it really does show everything. Interesting. I mean, Russian River is a wonderful place. That's where Williams Selyem got its start, was wonderful vineyards in the Russian River Valley. But there are wonderful vineyards, great vineyards across different appellations. The Vista Verde vineyard is a really unique site. It's a vineyard that we own, and it's in the Central Coast. It's south of Hollister, and you're probably thinking to yourself, "Holy smokes, Hollister is really hot." It can be very hot in Hollister, but where this vineyard is, it's up on the hilltop. It's actually south and east of Hollister, near a little town called Tres Pinos, and it has this wonderful exposure where it catches these wonderful breezes. The soil here is super unique. It's limestone in the soil. We don't see that here in Russian River. Here we see sand, we see fractured, volcanic, gravelly kind of soils, but we don't see limestone. So it's very unique from that perspective. Calera, which is another well-known Pinot Noir house, they're in the same area on the same kind of soil. So that to give you a little impression of other people making wine there. The wine, when you smell and taste it, it typically, there's usually a kind of a berry type element. It is a little bit, it comes in a little bit later than the Russian River Valley, and and that kind of speaks a little bit to how cool it can be. But really, it's the palate structure that's quite unique and fascinating to me, where that sort of soil type really gives a velvety kind of texture to the wine. I think there is an impression of crushed rocks and minerals in this particular wine, which is very unique. So you're tasting a wine from Russian River and the Vista Verde vineyard, and they're going to be completely different from a palate perspective. Even though the winemaking is nearly identical, so it really is about the place. Yeah, great nose, berry fruits, beautiful texture. That mineral kind of quality really comes through. Typically, it has a little bit less acidity to it, which kind of brings out that round, rich sort of mouthfeel. Pretty fascinating Pinot Noir for sure.
So, Carly, what are you getting out of the Vista Verde here?
I think this is it's a really interesting vineyard because, like Jeff was saying, it's not really what you would expect from that area when you hear, Hollister and that area. But I love how this ties in with the rest of our portfolio, and in that you get that really, really interesting, like tart cherry component that I have never tasted anything else from that area, which I think is really fascinating. And I think is a great, addition to our already very, traditional Russian River, beautiful red cherry portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have, I mentioned earlier, 25 Pinot Noirs. 19 of those are from individual vineyard sites, and it's a great study. I get to do it often enough, and I encourage all of you, if you have these bottles at home, to do some comparisons side by side from the same vintage. But it's such a unique and different wine, and it does. When you're going from wine to wine, it just has a unique quality that is distinctive, and that's why we make it as a vineyard designate wine for sure. Another one of those wines, moving on to the Weir, which is in a little known area called the Yorkville Highlands. Mark, what was the first year we made this? This was 2000, I think, 99, 2000.
I think 2000's right, because I remember that Bill Weir always tells a story about how he just kept delivering grapes to Bert, and finally, actually 98. Now that I recall. So
Right.
When the winery was sold in 98 was Bert's, and may he rest in peace, Bert's last year as winemaker, and that was the first year we made the Weir vineyard. So
Yeah.
he just kept on bringing grapes to Bert until Bert said, okay, they're good enough for me to make a wine out of it now.
And it's been an incredible run with this wine. I encourage you to get to know it, because it is one of my favorite vineyards, in that, one, it's a beautiful place to go and visit during the harvest season. It's just when you cross over into Mendocino County, you're climbing up this hill on Highway 128. It levels off, and this vineyard's sort of in that flat before you drop back down into the Anderson Valley. So it's just south of the Anderson Valley. Again, really unique terroir, really unique site. It's up on a hilltop, really super well-drained soils. Early 90s planting, so it's definitely got some age on it. It has these wonderful breezes that come through the vineyard, incredibly cool at night. And that's a really important thing. I mean, it's like, why we talk so much about in Russian River Valley, and if any of you, I'm sure many of you have had the opportunity to visit, we get that cooling fog effect. And effectively, the plants, at night, they kind of shut down. They're in that kind of 55 degree range, 52 degrees. And it really kind of slows down the ripening process and gives the plants a little breather, if you will. And the net effect of that is it helps preserve the acidity. Here at the Weir Vineyard, it's warm during the day, but it's super cold at night. Oftentimes when I'm going up there to sample, it'll be in the high 40s during the harvest season, where it'll be 52 or 53 degrees here. Just a fascinating climate. Rocky soils. When I smell and taste this wine, again, it's sort of about the red fruits, cherry, strawberry, that kind of thing. but it's really the palate, it's really the texture. I like to talk about texture with Pinot Noir because I think that's one of the hardest things to achieve, and I think this wine has beautiful tannin elegance, but it really has kind of a tenacity to the middle palate, and you talked about a little bit of minerality with some of the other wines, Mark. This wine to me has a tremendous amount of minerality. It's gravel, it's crushed rocks, it's quartz, all these kinds of elements that really come together with a few years of age. And it's, if you have an older bottle of Weir, I highly recommend, to enjoy it soon so you can kind of get the sense of what I'm talking about. Really gorgeous wine with a little bit of age.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get to the aging question after we finish tasting the wines. I know that was the most asked question, but let's move through from the Weir out to the Sonoma Coast to the Coastlands. So I know I've had a lot of experience visiting that vineyard. It's a really hard place to grow grapes, right? It's at about 700-foot elevation, so it sits just at the fog line, not above it, where most of our Sonoma Coast grapes come from. So tell us a little bit more about the wine, Jeff.
Yeah, so this particular site is up above the town of Occidental, which is a cool little bohemian, kind of town out on the coast. It's quite a treat to go and visit it, actually. And you climb up Coleman Valley Road. This is at the very end of a road called Fitzpatrick Lane. And yeah, as Mark said, it's kind of right at that transition of the fog. If you were any lower in elevation, you really would never see the sun, and therefore you could not ripen grapes. You wouldn't photosynthesize. But being at the transition, where it has some cooling effect from the fog, but then as the fog recedes, as the day goes on, the plants are able to wake up and photosynthesize. And ripen grapes. Also, typically, because of the coolness of the site, it literally has a view, as the name implies, a view of the Pacific, of the coast. It's typically one of our later vineyards that we pick. Put your nose in this glass if you haven't had the pleasure of smelling or tasting this wine. It smells to me like you're walking through a forest of redwood trees. It has this sort of like resinous quality. And there's a funny word that I like to use, particularly with this wine. Instead of terroir, I like to use the word airwar. When I'm walking around in this vineyard, you're smelling the redwood trees. There's old growth redwood trees that line this vineyard. You're smelling the ocean air. You're smelling, the redwood needles on the ground and the earthiness, and it's all rolled up into this wine, and it's quite extraordinary, actually.
Well, thank you. We're gonna, before we jump into the Zins, we're gonna take a detour for one of the questions that is not about wine but about allocation. So about 30 questions came in about how do we allocate the wines. Why do some people get more wines than others? And I'm going to make this as brief as possible because this should really be about wine. But when we do the allocations, what we're trying to do is give people what we think they want to order. So if you're a new customer, we give you a certain allocation, and if you buy it all, we try to give you more. And if you don't buy it all, we don't allocate you as much, not out of punishment, just out of we want to be able to allocate it to other people. But at the end of the day, it's a big math problem, which is really boring. We're just trying to make sure that we don't sell out too soon or too late. We know we're going to sell out, but we want to give as much access to the wines to as many customers as possible. And so we're really just trying to make sure that we can achieve that. And so sometimes it's not going to make sense. But it all comes down to how much of each individual wine we make. So for instance, in 2015, there were only 66 cases of Coastlands made. Well, with as many list customers we have, almost no one got an allocation of it, and their allocations were one bottle. And then sometimes it will be.
I got a few bottles.
But mostly because of me and Jeff, no one else could get any wine. But it really comes down to the wines that we make in larger volume, we can give larger allocations on. And so it may not always make sense, but I will say, and I say this to individuals, with as many people on this broadcast, it's a little scary to say this, but if there's something you want, the best way to get it is to ask for it. Because you're not looking at your individual allocations, you do it by groups. So if you didn't get a Precious Mountain and you want one, sometimes the best way to get it is to ask for it. Can't always get it for you, but we do pay attention to the comments and the emails and all that. So with that said, let's get back to wine. So we're going to move into the Zinfandels now. We make 4 Zinfandels at the winery now. In the fall release, it's the Bacigalupi, and our newest Zinfandel, the Saitone Estate. In the spring, we have, help me out here, people, I'm drawing a blank. What are
Papera and Finucchi.
And Finucchi Woodrow, thank you. So 4 Zinfandels, all from very old vines. Our latest acquisition of a vineyard property, the Saitone vineyard, was planted in 1895. So we're talking about 125-year-old vines. So Jeff, we'd love to hear the Zinfandel style in the winemaking, because I know that our style of Zin is a little different from most Zinfandel makers, since we're Noir producers. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. Kind of answer the question quickly, and you just take a step back, and the Pinot Noirs that you tasted all have a certain level of whole cluster during the in the fermentation. So we hand sort everything, they go into the tank, and then the balance of the grapes are destemmed on top. And typically for one of our Pinot Noirs, it's 25 to 30% whole cluster, and that's a traditional sort of to use the word Burgundian, old school kind of winemaking technique. I think that adds again sort of a layer to the wine. With Zinfandel, we 100% destem everything. There's no whole cluster. Zinfandel is kind of a unique animal in that oftentimes the stems they have greener flavors in them, and that would connote or translate into the wine with a little bit more vegetative sort of flavor and aroma. So typically we're not using the stems whatsoever. We're 100% destemming, and I think that's a traditional sort of a widespread sort of Zinfandel winemaking technique. Again, going back to the Zinfandels, all of our red wines are fermented in these horizontal, these dairy tanks, and they're open topped. If you can kind of picture sort of like a trough, an open top tank where the grapes are fermented, and so we use that same technique with the Zinfandels. And the net effect of that is having this sort of, the grapes kind of spread out over a wider area. The contact of the skin to the juice is a little bit more significant, so you can actually get, I think, the type of extraction that you're looking for, or that I'm looking for. And a lot of that relates to, again, both in the Pinot Noir and now in the Zinfandel, we practice a lot of foot treading. So we're actually getting inside the tanks and gently foot stomping the grapes to get a gentle extraction. We're actually never using a pump to macerate and pump over the tank, which is a typical winemaking technique. It's gently handled in these tanks. So I think when you taste our Zinfandels, you can taste, to me, sort of a Pinot Noir-esque kind of quality, which is, as to say that's more textural. It definitely has a little bit higher alcohol. That's typical for Zinfandel to get the full ripeness, and get rid of some of that vegetative quality. But they really have an elegance to them, which I think we're really proud of that style. Let's talk about that Bacigalupi. That's 2018. This comes just up the road, a few miles from that other family that were sort of pioneers in this area, the Bacigalupis. It's great to work with John and Pam and the family. They own some wonderful sites for Pinot Noir, and this particular site that we source our grapes from. I don't really ever get a full answer on this, but I think the grapes were probably planted in the 20s, so they're getting on 100 years old. It's a pure Zinfandel vineyard, which is slightly unique. Vineyards of this age were typically planted with multiple varieties, other red grapes like Allocation and Petit Syrah and things like that. Wonderful site. When I stick my nose in this glass, it's got this beautiful sort of a word that I like to describe is it's a fruit basket, right? It's got all these different berries in it, blueberries, blackberries, red fruit as well. And beautiful texture. Again, it has that sort of Pinot Noir-esque sort of quality to it.
And Jeff, if I may, my understanding is that what we do with the Zinfandels, and you use the word elegant, and all four that we make are certainly elegant. They really are showstoppers. People are so surprised how great these taste.
Yeah.
And I think one of the elements is because we're using French oak as opposed to everybody else in Dry Creek, etc., are using American oak, and that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think American oak in some people's minds can definitely match to the strength, I think, of Zinfandel. But getting back to that concept of a Pinot Noir house making Zinfandel, there is definitely 100% more elegance, and I think French oak barrels match our style better, right? So I think American oak would completely overpower this wine, give it a little bit more toothiness to it. For me, it's about finding the right sites, working with these great vineyards like Bacigalupi, having super elegant, French oak. Here, I'm using not our Francois Frere barrels that we use for the Pinot Noirs, but I'm using Terranceau, which offers, I think, a lot of nice structure without overpowering the wine. I mean, you stick your nose in that glass and you couldn't tell that there was actually any new oak in it. There's only about 25%, but it definitely is more in the background and not in the forefront. Absolutely.
And Jeff, the primary fermentation's in our steel dairy tanks, the open troughs, and then it moves into barrel. Just a clarifying question here.
For sure, yeah. And it's the same. No pumps, just go straight to gravity to barrels, malolactic in barrels. Now I'm talking just kind of broadly about kind of red wine making. Malolactics in barrels, blending in the springtime. That's its first racking. Goes back down to barrels, and then it's racked again just for bottling. So only 2 rackings, no pumps. Everything gets pushed around with argon gas. No pumps whatsoever. Pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Awesome. So let's move to the Saitone Estate Vineyard. So we purchased this property, Williams Selyem purchased this property in 2016 from the Saitone family, who owned it starting in the 1890s. As you can see there, the great, head-pruned vineyard, gnarly heads. It's really amazing to walk through there. And you really get a sense of the history of farming and grape growing in Russian River Valley if you get a chance to visit. But let's talk about the wine a little bit, Jeff.
Yeah, super interesting site. It's right in the sort of the sweet spot of Old Vine Zin. So right on Olivet Road and kind of near Piner. One of our other wines from the spring release called Papera is just 2 doors down from Saitone. There's some other vineyards that I've made wine from in that area that are historic and amazing. Yeah, it's in an area that has nice exposure, good sun. It's got nice deep soil. It's in a region of the Russian River called the Santa Rosa Plain, and yeah, just enjoys fantastic weather. A little bit of fog intrusion, not much, so it allows for Zinfandel to fully ripen. Typical of wines in this area, and certainly typical of Saitone. Again, is that sort of like red. There's a lot of dark fruit in it, but zesty red fruits as well. Here the pH is really low naturally, and so from a palate perspective, comparing it to the Bacigalupi, which is a little bit rounder, the Saitone has a little bit more edginess to it because of that great natural acidity. Really strong, robust tannin profile. But old vines tend to have, I think, wonderful palate texture, a lot of protein, a lot of richness in the middle palate. So it's a real sneaky wine. All those things that I told you, it's acidic and tannic, but there's this overlay of this incredible level of extract that just sort of cloaks all those elements, and it really creates a wine of oftentimes I like to describe these wines with sort of an electric sort of personality because of that acidity and richness, all kind of rolled up into one. It's a really fascinating Zinfandel, and it's a great pleasure to make a wine from such a historic site, planted in 1895.
Yeah, I know you're a big fan of Zins, Carly. What are you tasting here with the Saitone?
The Saitone is, it's funny that you say that I'm a big fan of Zins. I get a little bit picky about them, but when I find a really incredible Zinfandel, there's nothing like it. And for me, the Saitone, honestly, maybe it's just a little bit of a bias, but walking through the vineyard and seeing these vines that are, planted back in 1895 that look like goblin hands coming out of the earth. I mean, it almost like you can really feel the complexity in this wine that in my opinion, only comes from these really old vine Zins. Like what Jeff was mentioning about that really interesting balance between the acid and the tannin structure, and it almost has this vibrance to it that it's just an incredible wine. Breathtaking, I would put it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Hey, so we're doing pretty well on time. We had planned for an hour. Thought we might go over a little bit, but we want to get to some of your questions. And I will say, well, first of all, Jeff, all of these wines are amazing. It is the first time I'm tasting, a good portion of the lineup since they've been bottled. So, awesome job. But when we go out to Millbrook Winery or to do our pickup weekend or have pickup weekend here, hands down the most asked question and the most asked question that we received prior to this was the aging of the wines. How long do you age them? Do you age some more than others? Are there any rules of thumb that we can follow? So, Jeff, why don't you give us your personal philosophy on it?
Sure. Yeah. Real quick, thank you for the comments with the wines. I think it's an outstanding vintage. Call out to the production team. I mean, I have such an incredible team out in the vineyards and in the winery to make these wines happen. So it's as much a success for everybody on the production team. So thanks to them for sure. That question, during pickup weekend, I get that question asked probably 1,000 times over the course of the weekend, and oftentimes my direct answer is open the wine when you want to open it. Right? I think there's always a moment in time when there's something to appreciate about a well-crafted bottle of wine. Last night, for example, I wanted to drink. It was a super young wine, but wanted to drink 2018. Chablis, Burgundy, and it was way young, but it was like I was in the moment. I wanted to taste it and see what it was like. And for me, I learned something from that. I think you can also learn something for yourself about what type of wine you like, and that's sort of the next question that I often ask people. Do you like fruity, or do you like something with a little bit more earthy quality? Pinot Noir, as it sort of ages, develops, it loses more of that kind of what I call baby fat, that real exuberant fruit quality. And then it goes into something a little bit more earthy. So if you like that, tend to age them a little bit longer. But there are a few rules. Typically in the spring release, which we just finished, a lot of those wines, the Central Coast and the Sonoma County, those are meant to really be drunk on the earlier side. And then you're kind of graduating up with a few more years, to the Russian River and the Sonoma Coast while you're waiting for the vineyard designates. For me, I love old wines, and gosh, Mark and I've had the pleasure to drink a lot of old Williams Selyem over the years, and gosh, 20-year-old Rochiolis and Allens are absolutely amazing wines. And that suits my palate just fine. So yeah, open it when you want to open it, but I would follow that sort of algorithm. The regional wines, then the Appellation wines, and then the vineyard designate wines over the period of 5 to 10 years is probably a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, a rough way to look at it, and it's not perfect, is sometimes the price of the wine. The less expensive wines are
For sure.
ready to drink earlier than the more expensive wines. But one of the great things about Pinot Noir is it can age when you make it in our style. But we're tasting these 2018s, which generally would recommend 5 to 7 years age on these vineyard designates. But they're tasting great tonight. So you're certainly not going to be disappointed if you opened it early. It's just, if you like those secondary characteristics, the wine can certainly go longer than that.
And to kind of go back to Sandrew's food recommendations, a richer dish, a younger wine with a richer, more tannic Pinot Noir could actually be a perfect match. And so you have to really kind of match what you're. And obviously, I recommend a lot of our wines require food. So just pick the right dish to cook, and it'll be a winner.
So a real short answer for something that we got asked a lot is, what about pickup weekend? And unfortunately, here in California, we already know that we're going to have to cancel. So we're sorry, we're going to miss seeing all you guys. We haven't canceled Millbrook yet, although it's probably likely, but we're going to wait to make that call, because if things ease up back, it's not till November, so we're keeping our fingers crossed. A great winemaking question, Jeff, and I'm just sorry I'm rolling through the questions so fast. I just want to get a few people we have to sign off. What are the tried and true winemaking traditions at Williams Selyem that date back to Burt Williams?
Yeah, so we're a house of tradition. We still have some of those vineyards that Burt and Ed were making wine from. As I described earlier, the dairy tanks, those horizontal stainless steel open top tanks, that was one of their innovations that we continue to use today, 100% for the red wines. Francois Frere barrels, it's funny because a lot of this stuff, it was a bit of an evolution. A lot of the Francois. I remember Bert telling me that Jean and Noel from Francois Frere would come and taste the wines with them, and really, I think they developed a nice relationship with them and crafted a barrel that really suited Williams Selyem styled wines. The whole cluster, we still use today. We have our own proprietary Williams Selyem yeast that Bert isolated from a fermentation. We still use that. So the core elements of what was done, and we're going into our 40th vintage here at Williams Selyem, which is pretty amazing. A lot of those core elements that were used, or those innovations from back then, are still used today. So the main difference is we have the seasonality. We do have a number of different vineyards that Bert and Ed were making wine from, but the spirit of what we do, the trying to highlight the sense of place and everything that we do is that's definitely a core value, I guess, core element of what was done back then.
Awesome. So a couple of rapid fire questions. Will there ever be a Hirsch again?
Possibly. We're actually been talking to David and to Jasmine, and there's a possibility of getting some fruit this year, which I'm pretty excited about. So yeah, absolutely.
And then somebody asked about, since we don't have morning dew, is there anything in the pipeline that might replace that?
For sure, yeah. There's, what vintage was it? It was just this past year, 2019. So this wine won't be released until 2021, but it was able to pick up some fruit from a pretty historic vineyard called Savoy. It's on the really far end of the Anderson Valley. It's a pretty amazing site, and there's some wonderful producers making wine from Savoy. So yeah, look for that. It's a small production wine. It's kind of in that neighborhood of Morning Dew that Bert owned. I'm pretty excited about it. Yeah, pretty cool wine. Yeah.
And then a couple of COVID questions came in. We are still currently open for tastings by appointment. It is all outside, following the safety protocols. You have to enter wearing a mask and everything that everyone's getting used to now. It changes rapidly around here, though. So please check in with the winery if you do want to visit. And then through the chat, and by the way, thank you everyone for all the comments. And I did manage to mostly keep a straight face. Y'all know who you are out there too, by the way. But a lot of questions about our relatively new Cabernet Sauvignon that we're making from the Beckstoffer George III Vineyard. Questions about how long to age that, what style of Cabernet. So, we're down to the last minute or two, Jeff. So tell us a little bit about the Cabernet program.
Sure. Yeah, this is a pretty exciting program. 2016 was our first release of Beckstoffer George III, which is a historic vineyard in Rutherford. Typically, back in the day, it was used in the Georges de la Tour bottlings of Bulow Vineyards. Wonderful site on the Silverado side of Rutherford. What was unique, what I found unique about it was texture. Again, there's that word. It has such an incredible earthy, loamy kind of texture to it. It's made with a Pinot Noir, sort of mentality. And what I mean by that is it's made in our dairy tanks with our Williams Selyem yeast, using Terranceau barrels, not Francois Frere barrels. But that foot treading, kind of technique with magnificently grown Cabernet, it brings out wonderful texture. To me, it's a unique wine. One of my very first loves of wine was Bordeaux. Studied, tasted, visited, collected Bordeaux's like I do today still. And so to me, it's sort of, it's a nod to California because it's definitely some of the best fruit in the state. But it takes a little bit more of a Bordelais sort of direction. So if that kind of paints a picture of what the wine's like, definitely very elegant, but can age for, who knows, for a while. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you need to hold it for 25 years like a Lafite or something like that, but it definitely has staying power. Beautiful texture, great fruit purity. It's a pretty exciting wine. Absolutely.
Well, listen, thank you all for joining us. We do have the most amazing customers. You are a pleasure to meet and talk to and read your comments from. And we have a lot of friends out there who are watching and we've known for years through the winery and seen it pick up weekends. And glad we could connect with you this way. We are going to be doing this probably on an ongoing basis, even when things get back to more normal, because it is a great way for us to showcase these wines and give you some information about it. So we appreciate you tuning in. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you in person. The release opens in a couple of weeks, so keep an eye on your inbox, and thank you for your support. Stay safe and healthy, and cheers, everyone.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Okay.